My name is Evelisse Lane. I was 33 when the sound of my own mother-in-law's hand against my cheek became the sound that ended one version of my life and began another. It happened on a Tuesday. I remember that detail with a strange, almost clinical precision, the way trauma sometimes fossilizes the smallest, most useless facts. My daughter, Marisol, was 6 days old. She weighed exactly what she'd weighed at the hospital, not an ounce more, and I was terrified about that, the way new mothers are terrified about everything and nothing at once. The kitchen still smelled like the ginger tea I'd been steeping for my sore throat. That's what I was doing when Doreen came in, steeping tea, one hand under my daughter's head, humming something I didn't even realize I knew the words to. Doreen didn't knock. She never knocked. She let herself into her son's house the way she let herself into every room of his life, as if ownership were simply a matter of will. She said I'd let the baby cry too long the night before. She said the neighbors had heard. She said a mother who couldn't quiet her own child had no business calling herself capable. I remember answering her calmly, too calmly maybe, and that composure seemed to provoke her more than any argument could have. The slap came before I understood it was coming. Not hard enough to bruise. Hard enough to silence a house. Marisol didn't cry. That was the strange, sacred cruelty of the moment. My daughter slept on, unaware, while my own face burned and my ears rang faintly, like the moment after a door slams somewhere far off. I didn't scream. I didn't drop her. I held my daughter tighter, the way you hold something when the ground is just tilted beneath you, and I looked at Doreen with an expression I still can't fully name. Not hatred, not yet, but the birth of something quieter and more permanent. My husband, Adrian, walked in seconds later. He'd heard the sound from the hallway. I remember thinking in that first flooded second that he would say something, that he would move toward me, that the 6 years we'd built, the apartment we painted together, the fights we'd survived, the nights we whispered about names for a daughter we hadn't met yet, would mean something in that moment. Instead, he looked at his mother, then at me, then at the baby in my arms, and he said 4 words that would end our marriage long before either of us admitted it out loud. Get out. Both of you. I didn't ask which of us he meant. I already knew. I want to tell you I fought. I want to tell you I raised my voice, that I demanded he explain himself, that I made him look at the red mark blooming on my cheek like evidence in a trial he refused to hold. But grief doesn't always arrive as noise. Sometimes it arrives as a terrible, functional silence, the kind that lets you fold 3 days of baby clothes into a duffel bag without your hands shaking, because shaking would mean feeling, and feeling would mean breaking, and you cannot break while someone small and new depends entirely on your arms. I called my sister, Priya, from the passenger seat of a rideshare, Marisol strapped into a car seat I'd bought used, and installed myself, alone, 8 months pregnant, while Adrian was at a work dinner he swore he couldn't miss. Priya didn't ask questions. She just said, "Come," the way people say it when they already know the shape of what's coming. I spent that first night on her pull-out couch, listening to my daughter breathe, replaying the sound of the slap on some internal loop I couldn't shut off. Not the pain of it. The pain faded within the hour. It was the silence after that stayed with me. Adrian's silence. The way he hadn't stepped between us. The way his mother's hand had felt, somehow, like something he'd been quietly permitting for years, one small erasure at a time. I thought about our wedding. Doreen had worn white, not ivory, not champagne, white, and everyone had laughed it off as eccentricity. I thought about the nursery she'd redecorated without asking, the pediatrician she'd tried to choose for us, the dozens of small invasions I'd absorbed because Adrian always said, "She means well, she's just intense. Give her time." I understood, lying there in the dark with my daughter's small weight against my chest, that I had spent years mistaking his conflict avoidance for loyalty to me. It had never been loyalty. It had been convenience. It was easier to let his mother win small battles than to ever have the larger conversation about where his allegiance actually lived. I didn't cry that night. I made a list instead. Hospital bills, my name on the lease, the joint account, my mother's old lawyer's number scrawled in a birthday card from years ago. Somewhere between the second and third item, I realized I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning survival. The difference I would learn, mattered more than anything else that followed. The days after are a blur I've had to reconstruct, the way you reconstruct a fever, through fragments, through other people's memories more than your own. Priya remembers me eating very little. I remember the hum of her refrigerator at 3 a.m. and the particular ache of nursing a child while wondering if I'd just become a woman without a home. Adrian called on the fourth day, not to apologize, to explain. He used the word misunderstanding, which struck me as almost comic in its inadequacy. A misunderstanding is a wrong turn, a mixed-up reservation. This had been a hand against my face and 4 words that told me exactly where I ranked in his house. He said his mother hadn't meant it the way it looked. He said I'd provoked her by shutting her out of the baby's first week. He said, and this is the line I returned to most often, the one that finally cracked something open in me, "You know how she is. You should have just let it go. You should have just let it go." I sat with that sentence for a long time after we hung up, not because it hurt, though it did, because it revealed something I'd suspected but never let myself fully see. In Adrian's mind, my dignity had always been negotiable. A line item to be adjusted whenever it inconvenienced someone else's comfort. I didn't call a lawyer out of anger. I called out of clarity. Marguerite Okafor had been my mother's attorney for property disputes years ago, sharp-eyed and unhurried, the kind of woman who listened twice as long as she spoke. I told her everything. The slap, the eviction, the 6 years of small erasures I'd only now begun to name aloud. She didn't tell me what to feel. She asked what I wanted. Not what I wanted to happen to Adrian or to Doreen, what I wanted for myself and for Marisol. It was the first time in days someone had asked me a question that didn't begin and end with damage control. I told her I wanted the truth documented. I wanted my name protected. I wanted, more than anything, for my daughter to never grow up believing that love meant absorbing whatever was done to you and calling it peace. Marguerite smiled for the first time in that meeting. "Then we don't need revenge," she said. "We need a record." I didn't fully understand what she meant. Not yet. But I wrote the phrase down anyway, in the same small notebook where I'd once written baby names, because something told me I would need to remember it. The apartment Adrian and I shared was still legally half mine. My name was on the lease. My income had covered 1/3 of the rent since the beginning, and I had 6 years of bank transfers to prove it. Marguerite was patient in a way I wasn't used to. She didn't rush toward confrontation. She built a foundation first, quietly, the way you'd reinforce a house before a storm rather than after. I went back once, with Priya beside me and a locksmith's business card in my pocket that I never had to use, because Adrian, to my surprise, opened the door himself. He looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but in some essential way, as if the 4 words he'd said a week earlier had cost him something too, even if he couldn't yet admit what. Doreen wasn't there. That mattered. It meant he'd had time alone with what he'd done. I didn't yell. I didn't perform the grief I'd carried for 7 days. I simply told him I was retrieving my belongings and Marisol's things, and that Marguerite would be in touch regarding the lease and the shared accounts. He tried, briefly, to soften the room. "We can talk about this, Eve. You don't have to bring lawyers into it." And I remember feeling something shift in me, cold and clean as morning air. "You brought a hand into it," I said. "I'm just bringing paper." It wasn't cruelty. I want to be precise about that because precision was the only weapon I allowed myself. I never raised my voice at him. Not once, in the entire unraveling of our marriage. I had learned, watching Doreen for 6 years, exactly what unchecked anger costs a person's credibility. I chose the opposite. I chose to be so calm, so documented, so unshakably reasonable that no one, not him, not his mother, not eventually a mediator, not even my own doubting heart, could accuse me of overreacting. That night, back at Priya's, I opened the notebook again and wrote a single line beneath Marguerite's words. Asterisk, truth doesn't need volume. It only needs to be written down correctly. Asterisk. I didn't know yet that Doreen had, for years, been quietly documenting her own version of events in group texts with Adrian's cousins, a version where I was cold, ungrateful, difficult, unstable. I didn't know that those messages would eventually surface, unprompted, offered by a cousin who'd grown uncomfortable with what she'd witnessed. I only knew, in that quiet apartment at midnight, that I had chosen the harder, slower path of building something true instead of something loud. It would take months before I understood that this choice was the revenge itself. Mediation happened on a gray Thursday in a conference room that smelled faintly of stale coffee and hand sanitizer. Adrian arrived without his mother, which I noted the way you note a small shift in weather. Not proof of anything, but a signal. He looked tired in the way people look tired when they've spent weeks constructing a version of events they don't fully believe themselves. His lawyer spoke first, gesturing toward reconciliation and family healing in the soft, procedural language of people paid to smooth things over. I let it wash past me. I had learned, by then, the particular power of silence used correctly, not the silence of submission but the silence of someone who no longer needs to convince anyone of her own pain. Marguerite spoke plainly. She laid out the financial record, my contributions, my name on the documents, 6 years of a life built jointly and undeniably. Then, without theatrics, she mentioned the messages. Doreen's cousin, a woman named Fabian I had met perhaps 4 times at holidays, had sent screenshots weeks earlier, unprompted, almost apologetic, as if she'd been carrying a private discomfort she needed to set down. In those messages, Doreen had described, in her own words and her own timeline, handling me the week after Marisol's birth. She had not called it a slap. She had called it getting through to her. But the timestamp matched. The tone matched. The truth, once written in someone else's hand, no longer needed my voice to be believed. I watched something drain out of Adrian's face as Marguerite read the relevant lines aloud, calm as a woman reciting a grocery list. He didn't defend his mother this time. He didn't defend himself either. He simply looked at the table, and for one brief, almost unbearable moment, I felt something close to grief on his behalf. Not because I still loved him in the way I once had, but because I understood, watching him, that he was only now confronting a truth I had been forced to live inside for over a week alone. I didn't gloat. I didn't say I told you so, though every fiber of the old, wounded Evelisse wanted to. I simply asked, when it was my turn to speak, for 2 things: full custody arrangements that protected my daughter's stability and an acknowledgement, in writing, of what had actually happened in that kitchen. Not an apology performed for a room. A record. Because some truths don't need to be forgiven to be finished. They only need to be named correctly, once, by the people who caused them. Adrian's lawyer asked for a recess. When they returned, the tone of the room had changed entirely. The agreement that followed wasn't dramatic. There was no courtroom scene, no raised voices, no moment where anyone finally got what they deserved in the way revenge stories promise. There was only a quiet, procedural correction of a life that had been misaligned for years, custody terms that gave me primary care with generous, structured visitation, a fair division of what we'd built together, and, buried in a paragraph Marguerite had insisted on, written acknowledgement from Adrian that the incident in the kitchen had occurred as I described it, and that no future arrangement would place Marisol in his mother's unsupervised care, without my consent. It wasn't punishment. It was protection. I had stopped, somewhere in those long weeks, wanting Doreen to suffer. What I wanted was simpler and, I think, more powerful. I wanted the truth to exist somewhere permanent, outside the reach of her group texts and her rewritten memories. I wanted a version of events that didn't depend on anyone believing me, because it was already written down, signed, and filed. Adrian tried once in the hallway outside the mediation office to say something more personal. Not an apology exactly, an attempt at explanation. He said he hadn't known how to stand between his mother and his wife, that he'd spent his whole life learning to keep the peace with her instead of learning to protect anyone from her. I believed him. That was the strange, unexpected mercy of the moment. I believed he wasn't a villain, only a man who had never once had to choose, until the day choosing became unavoidable, and he'd chosen wrong in the second that mattered most. I hope you learn to stand somewhere, I told him. Just not standing between us anymore. I didn't wait for a response. I picked up my daughter's diaper bag from the chair beside me, and I walked out of that building into ordinary afternoon light, and for the first time in weeks, I noticed that the sun was out. Doreen tried to reach me twice in the following month, once through a mutual cousin, once through an unmarked number I recognized on the third ring and let go to voicemail. I never listened to it. Some doors don't need to be slammed shut. They simply need to remain quietly closed. 6 months passed the way recovery actually passes, not in a single cinematic turn, but in 1,000 small, unremarkable Tuesdays. I found a 2-bedroom apartment with good light in the kitchen, the kind of light that made even reheated coffee feel like something worth savoring. Marisol learned to laugh at the sound of running water. I learned to sleep through an entire night without waking at every creak of the building, bracing for a knock that never came from Priya's door. I went back to work part-time, then full-time, at the design firm I'd paused my career for. My colleagues didn't ask many questions, and I didn't offer many answers. Some healing happens in the quiet, unglamorous return to ordinary competence, showing up, doing good work, discovering that you are still, underneath everything, a capable woman and not merely a wounded one. Adrian and I settled into something that resembled cordial coexistence. He picked Marisol up on schedule. He asked sometimes in the stilted way of a man still learning a new language, how I was doing. I answered honestly, but briefly, the way you'd answer a coworker rather than a husband, because that, I understood now, was closer to what we had actually always been, two people who had built a life together without ever quite building a partnership. Doreen, I heard through the same cousin who'd once sent the messages, had grown quieter within the family. Not punished. Not exiled. Simply smaller. The story of what happened had traveled, in its own slow way, through relatives who'd once laughed off her intensity. I hadn't spread it. I hadn't needed to. The truth, once documented, has its own gravity. It doesn't require a messenger. I thought I would feel triumphant when I finally heard this. Instead, I felt something quieter, a kind of tired peace, the peace of a woman who no longer has to perform forgiveness or fury for anyone else's comfort. One evening, folding Marisol's small shirts on my own bed in my own apartment, I found myself thinking not of the slap, not of Adrian's 4 words, but of the ginger tea I'd been steeping that Tuesday morning, the smell of it filling a kitchen that no longer belonged to me. I realized I could remember the scent without the sting. That, I think, is the quiet architecture of healing, not forgetting but no longer bleeding from the memory. Marisol is walking now. She has Adrian's eyes and, I'm told, my stubborn chin, and on weekends when he brings her back from his apartment, we stand in my doorway for a moment longer than strictly necessary, two people who once built a whole future together, now building something smaller and more honest instead, a shared, careful commitment to raising a daughter who will never inherit the silence I once mistook for peace. I kept the notebook. It sits on a shelf in my new apartment, its early pages full of baby names, its later pages full of Marguerite's calm instructions, and my own handwriting growing steadier with each entry. I read it sometimes, not out of nostalgia, but as a kind of proof, evidence that a woman can walk through the exact center of her own unraveling and come out the other side still whole, still capable of tenderness, still able to hum to her daughter in a kitchen that finally, entirely belongs to her. I don't know if Doreen has changed. I've stopped needing to know. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for the ones who hurt them to become someone else, and I understand now that this waiting is its own quiet trap. My freedom didn't arrive because she apologized. It arrived the moment I stopped requiring her apology to move forward. There's a particular kind of light that comes into my kitchen in the late afternoon now, gold, low, unhurried, exactly the kind I imagine I was reaching for that Tuesday morning with my tea, before everything broke open. I stand in it sometimes, Marisol on my hip, and I think about the woman I was that day, and the woman I've become since, and I don't feel anger anymore when I make that comparison. I feel something closer to respect. My name is Evelisse Lane. I was 33 when my mother-in-law's hand taught me, in the cruelest way possible, exactly how much silence I had been keeping to preserve a peace that was never mine to protect. I am 34 now. My daughter sleeps soundly in a home with no locked doors, no raised hands, no rooms where I have to make myself smaller to be tolerated. Some stories end in fire. Mine ended in daylight, quiet, deliberate, and entirely my own.